The mud was still on her boots when she walked through the servants' entrance of Ashveil House, the house that had been her mother's and her grandmother's before that, and which now belonged, by a sequence of documents she had never been permitted to read, to a man named Lord Calder. She gave her name as Mabel. It was close enough to her real name that she thought she could answer to it without hesitating. The housekeeper, Mrs. Drummond, had looked at her hands when she said it, the way housekeepers always looked at hands, and whatever she saw there made her pause. "You've not done service before," Mrs. Drummond said. It was not a question. "I learn quickly," said Mirabel, who had been Mirabel Ashveil until 14 months ago, when her uncle had produced a will no one had seen before, and the solicitor had looked at her with something that was not quite pity and not quite apology, and said there was nothing to be done. Mrs. Drummond looked at her hands again, and then at her face, and then, apparently deciding something, handed her an apron. That was how it began. She had not planned exactly to deceive anyone. What she had planned, to the extent that she had planned anything in those first weeks after losing the house, was simply to see it again, to walk the halls once more, to stand in the library where her mother used to read to her on winter afternoons and see if it still smelled the same, like cedar and old paper and the particular kind of cold that settles into stone walls no matter how many fires you light. She had not expected to be taken on as housemaid. She had not expected Lord Calder to be in residence. The letters she had received, forwarded by the solicitor's clerk, who had been kinder to her than the solicitor himself, had indicated that the new master of Ashveil House spent most of the year at his estate in Northumberland, that Ashveil was, for him, an inconvenient property acquired through some business arrangement she did not fully understand, more trouble than it was worth, likely to be sold within the year. He was not supposed to be here, but he was. She had seen him on her third morning, crossing the courtyard from the stables, coat dusty from riding, speaking to the head groom in a tone she could not hear from the kitchen window. He was taller than she had expected. That was the first thing she noticed. The second was that he moved through the courtyard of Ashveil House with the ease of someone who had been doing it for years, and something about that ease made her chest feel tight in a way she did not know how to name. She turned back to the breakfast things. Mrs. Drummond was not unkind. She was particular, which was different. She had been housekeeper at Ashveil House for 11 years. She said this with a certain quiet dignity, as though 11 years of service in one house was a kind of achievement, which Mirabel supposed it was. And she ran the household with a precision that bordered on the military. "His lordship takes breakfast at 8, she told Mirabel on the first morning. "He does not like to be disturbed before then. He does not like conversation at meals. He does not like unnecessary noise in the east corridor before 9, because that is where his study is, and he works early." "What does he like?" Mirabel asked, before she could stop herself. Mrs. Drummond looked at her. "He likes the house to run well," she said. "That is what he likes." It seemed, Mirabel thought, like a rather lonely list of preferences. She did not say that. The library was smaller than she remembered, which was always the way with rooms you had loved as a child. The shelves still reached the ceiling. The window that faced the garden still let in the same particular quality of afternoon light, the kind that turned everything it touched a faint shade of amber. The fireplace had a new grate, iron, plain, nothing like the old brass one her mother had polished herself every autumn, insisting it was not work she would give to anyone else. Mirabel stood in the doorway with a dustcloth in her hands and tried not to look like someone who was coming home. "You can come in," she startled. Lord Calder was sitting in the chair by the window, a book open on his knee. She had not seen him because the chair faced the garden and she had only looked at the shelves. "I'm sorry, my lord," she said. "I didn't know you were. Mrs. Drummond said the library was to be done on Thursdays." "It is Thursday," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." He looked at her for a moment. His eyes were gray, or something close to gray, the kind of color that shifted depending on the light. He looked, she thought, like a man who was accustomed to looking at things carefully before he said anything about them. "Then do what you came to do," he said, and returned to his book. She had been in the library for 20 minutes before she allowed herself to look at the shelf beside the fireplace. She knew what was on it, had known since she was 7 years old, had reached up for it on her tiptoes while her mother laughed and said, "Not yet, not quite yet." The small portrait in a gilt frame, no bigger than a hand, her grandmother, painted the year before she married. Her mother had always kept it there, in that spot, because she said the light hit it right in the afternoons. It was still there. She stood looking at it for longer than she meant to. "That was there when I arrived," said Lord Calder behind her. She had not heard him move. "I didn't put it there. I left it because I didn't know what else to do with it." She turned. He was standing a few feet away, watching her with that careful gray look. "She's very like you," he said. Mirabel said nothing. "The woman in the portrait," he said. "She has the same." He stopped. Something in his face changed, not dramatically, just a small shift, like a door that had been left open being quietly closed. "It doesn't matter," he said. "Carry on." He left. She stood with the dust cloth in her hands and her heart beating in a way that had nothing to do with being startled. And she looked at her grandmother's face in the gilt frame and thought, he noticed. She had not told anyone who she was. She had thought about it, had composed the conversation in her head 100 times during the long coach journey north, had imagined handing the solicitor letter to some faceless servant at the door, had imagined demanding to see the study, the papers, the will. She had imagined, in her worst moments, standing in the front hall of Ashveil House and simply refusing to leave. But she had no legal standing. The solicitor had been clear about that, in the particular way of solicitors, which was to say everything plainly while somehow implying that you were foolish for having expected otherwise. The will was valid. The transfer was complete. Mirabel Ashveil, 24 years of age, only child of the late Gilbert Ashveil, was entitled to exactly what her father's will specified: a small annual income, the contents of her mother's writing desk, and nothing else. The house was gone, so she had come the only way she could. She had not expected it to be so hard. Not the work. She had been prepared for the work, had spent 3 weeks before arriving reading a housekeeping manual, so thoroughly she could have recited the proper method for cleaning silver in her sleep. She had not been prepared for the smell of the entrance hall, which was exactly the same as it had always been. She had not been prepared for the sound of her boots on the stairs, which creaked in the exact places she remembered. She had not been prepared for the way the kitchen garden looked through the scullery window. Her mother's roses, still there, still climbing the south wall, a little more overgrown than they used to be, but there, unmistakably there, as though they had simply been waiting. She had not been prepared for Lord Calder. It was the cook, Mrs. Pell, who told her the shape of him, the way servants always tell each other the shape of their employers, in small pieces, over meals, in the gaps between tasks. "He's not bad," Mrs. Pell said, which seemed to be the highest praise she offered anyone. "Doesn't shout, pays on time, doesn't come into the kitchen asking questions." "Has he been here long?" Mirabel asked carefully. 8 months. Came in autumn. Mrs. Pell paused, rolling pastry with the focused attention of someone for whom pastry was a serious matter. "He was in a state when he arrived, I'll tell you that. Not that he said so. Men like that never say so. But you can tell. He had that look about him." "What look?" "Like something had gone wrong that he hadn't expected to go wrong." She looked up. "Lost his wife, I heard. Year before." Mirabel did not say anything. "Comes here to get away from the Northumberland estate, I think," Mrs. Pell said. "Too many memories, That's what Mr. Finch thinks, anyway. Mr. Finch was the steward. He and Mrs. Pell had worked together long enough that his opinions were treated in the kitchen as a kind of settled wisdom. He'll sell this place eventually, I expect. That's what Mr. Finch says. That night, in the small room, she shared with one of the other maids, a cheerful girl named Aggie, who asked no questions and fell asleep immediately after supper. Mirabel lay awake and thought about a man who had come to a house full of someone else's memories to escape a house full of his own. It did not make her feel differently about the house, but it made her feel differently about him. The papers were in the study. She knew they must be. The solicitor's copies were in London, but Lord Calder was not the sort of man, she was beginning to understand, who kept his affairs at a distance. He worked every morning in the study for 3 hours before any other business. Mr. Finch brought him reports there. Letters came and were answered the same day. She had no right to see them. She knew that. She also knew, and this knowledge sat in her chest like a stone, that her uncle had signed his name to a document she had never seen, describing a meeting with her father that she did not believe had taken place, and that a solicitor had accepted it without, as far as she could tell, asking a single question. She was not looking to steal anything. She told herself that every morning. She was looking to understand. It was a Thursday, 3 weeks after she had arrived, when Lord Calder did not come to breakfast. Mrs. Drummond sent the underfootman to inquire and received word that his lordship was riding and would not be back until midday. She reassigned the morning's tasks accordingly. Mirabel was given the study. She went. The room smelled of wood smoke and ink. The desk was orderly, not aggressively so, not the desk of a man who imposed order for its own sake, but tidily, practically arranged, as though he simply knew where everything was and returned it there out of habit. On the right side of the desk there was a stack of correspondence. On the left, a leather portfolio closed with the initials R.C. embossed in the corner. R.C. She had not known his first name. She did not think of him as anything except Lord Calder or his lordship, or occasionally, in the privacy of her own head, him. But there it was. R.C. She did not open the portfolio. She dusted the mantelpiece. She cleaned the grate. She wiped the window ledges and straightened the chairs, and was leaving, was nearly at the door, the dustcloth in her hands, her task complete and her conscience largely intact, when she saw the letter. It had fallen or been placed on the floor beside the desk, half under the near leg. It might have slid there, the sort of thing that happened. She picked it up, meaning only to set it on the desk, and saw her father's name, Mr. Gilbert Ashveil. She stood very still. The letter was in her uncle's hand. She knew that hand, had watched it sign birthday cards, had seen it in the margins of books borrowed and never returned. She recognized the particular way he formed his G's, the slight backward slant of the letters. It was dated 6 weeks before her father died. She read the first line, then the second. Then she set it down on the desk, very carefully, exactly where it had been, and walked out of the study and down the corridor and into the linen closet, which was the nearest room with a door that locked, and stood there in the dark among the folded sheets and shook. She did not go back to the study. She carried what she had read the way you carry something breakable, carefully, at a slight distance from yourself, not thinking about it directly. She thought around it. She thought about the roses in the kitchen garden, and the creak of the stairs, and the portrait in the library. And she did not think about what her uncle had written to the solicitor about her father's state of mind in those final weeks. She had been 2 days in this state when Lord Calder stopped her in the corridor outside the library. She was carrying a basket of kindling. He was coming from the direction of the study, coat on, clearly about to go out. He stopped. "You've been avoiding the library," he said. She had not expected that. She had expected, if he spoke to her at all, something about the fires or the lamps or the state of the east corridor. "I haven't," she said, which was a lie, and she suspected he knew it. He looked at her for a moment. That careful look. She had grown accustomed to it without meaning to. "The portrait," he said. She said nothing. "It isn't just a resemblance," he said. "I should have realized sooner. I did realize sooner. I simply wasn't certain what to do with it." He paused. "You have the same hands." She looked down at her hands, which were holding the basket of kindling, and were, she noticed, trembling very slightly. "My lord," she said. "What is your name?" he asked. "Your real name?" She looked up. He was watching her with an expression she could not quite read. Not anger, not accusation. Something more careful than either of those. "Mabel," she said, and she heard how thin it sounded, how unconvincing, how much it cost her. "Mabel," he repeated, as though he were weighing it. "No, I don't think so." She set the basket down. Her arms had become unreliable. "Mirabel," she said. "Mirabel Ashveil." He was quiet for long enough that she had time to look at the floor and the wall and back at him, and he had not moved. "This is your house," he said. It was not a question. "It was," she said. "It was," he agreed quietly. She told him, then not all of it, not at once, but the shape of it. Her father's illness. Her uncle's sudden appearance with documents she had never known existed, the solicitor's manner. The meeting she did not believe had taken place. She told him, standing in the corridor outside the library, with the basket of kindling on the floor between them, and he listened without interrupting, which was not what she had expected. She had expected, if she ever told anyone, to be disbelieved or dismissed or asked why she had not engaged a solicitor of her own. The question everyone asked, as though a woman alone with a small annual income and no family to speak of had simply overlooked that option. He did not ask that. When she stopped talking, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The letter you found in the study." She went still. "I left it there," he said, "because I was not yet certain what to do with it." Something in his voice was careful in the way of a man who is angry about something and has decided not to be angry about it until he has understood it fully. "I received it 3 weeks ago, from the solicitor's office, the original solicitor's clerk, who has since changed his employment." He enclosed a note. He paused. He said he had been troubled at the time. He said he had been very young. Mirabel looked at him. "I have been corresponding with my own solicitor in Edinburgh," Lord Calder said, "for the past 3 weeks. The situation is," he stopped. He looked at the wall and then at her. "It is not simple," he said. "I will not pretend it is simple. But it is not impossible." She did not trust herself to speak. "You could have told me who you were," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite reproach. Something that was, she thought, the space where reproach might have been if he had chosen it and had not. "I didn't know what you were," she said. He looked at her steadily. "And now?" She thought about it, honestly thought, the way she had not let herself think in weeks. She thought about Mrs. Pell, who was not unkind. She thought about Mrs. Drummond's careful hands. She thought about a man who had come to an unfamiliar house to grieve a loss he did not speak of, and who had left a letter on the floor of his study, and who had noticed a portrait because a woman had the same hands as her grandmother. "I don't know yet," she said. He almost smiled. She was not certain. It was a very small thing, whatever it was, a shift in the corner of his mouth. "That," he said, "is the most honest thing you have said to me since you arrived." She stayed. That was the decision, though it did not feel like a decision. Not exactly. It felt more like an absence of the other decision, the one where she left, went back to the rented rooms in Edinburgh, resumed the life of careful economy she had been building out of very few materials. That decision did not come. She waited for it, and it did not come, and so she stayed. She did not stay as Mabel. Mrs. Drummond was told the truth, quietly, in the housekeeper's sitting room, over tea that Mrs. Drummond poured with the same precision she brought to everything. Mrs. Drummond listened without expression and then said, "I thought your hands were wrong," and then poured her more tea. Aggie, who shared her room, was delighted in the way of someone for whom this kind of story was exactly what the world should contain. She told no one, because Mirabel asked her not to, and Aggie turned out to be the sort of person who kept her word. The solicitor in Edinburgh wrote, and wrote again. There were documents. There were a great many documents, which was the nature of the thing. The undoing of a lie was not clean, was not quick, required more paper than the lie itself had, as though the truth were somehow more complicated than the deception, which Mirabel supposed, in practical terms, it often was. Her uncle did not write. She had not expected him to. She was in the kitchen garden, cutting back the roses, the way her mother had always done in October, wearing gloves that were too large and carrying the secateurs she had found in the potting shed where they had always been kept. When Lord Calder came to find her, she heard him before she saw him. The gate, the particular sound of his boots on the stone path. The Edinburgh solicitor has written, he said. She kept working. Her hands were steadier than she expected. And, she said, and there will be more letters, he said, and more time. I won't pretend otherwise. I know. But the original transaction, he paused, was predicated on a document that the clerk has now signed a statement about, which changes the matter materially. She set down the secateurs and turned to look at him. He was standing at the edge of the rose bed, hands in his pockets, looking at her with that gray, careful gaze. He looked, she thought, slightly less closed than he had the first day she had seen him from the kitchen window. The same man, but the door not quite as firmly shut. How long? She asked. Possibly a year, possibly more. She thought about that. A year was a long time to live in someone else's house. A year was also, she thought, not as long as 14 months of loss. I want to be useful, she said. While I'm here, I don't want to simply. She stopped. I don't know what I'm trying to say. You're trying to say, he said, that you've been taking care of this house your whole life and you don't intend to stop now. She looked at him. The roses were your mother's, he said. It was not a question. Yes, they were the first thing I noticed when I arrived. He looked at them, the sprawling, untidy climbers on the south wall, now in the particular beautiful disorder of late autumn, not dead, not dormant yet, still putting out the last pale blooms. I don't know anything about roses. I left them because they seemed to know what they were doing. They do, Mirabel said. You only have to let them. He looked at her then, and something in that look was different from the others, less careful, or differently careful, or perhaps the care was still there but directed at something slightly different than before. Mirabel, he said. Her name, her real name, in his mouth. She had heard him say it before, in the solicitor's correspondence, in Mrs. Drummond's sitting room, in the corridor outside the library. But something about this time was different. Something about the roses and the October light and the way he said it, as though he had been saying it for a long time, and was only now saying it aloud. Yes, she said. I have been writing Edinburgh, he said, because it is the right thing to do, because what was done to your father was wrong, and what was done to you was wrong, and I will spend whatever it costs to correct it. She waited. But I want you to know, he said, that I am also writing to Edinburgh because... He stopped. He looked at the roses again and then at her. Because this house has been considerably less empty since you arrived in it, and I am not entirely certain what to do with that. Mirabel was quiet for a long moment. The garden was still. A bird was doing something complicated in the yew hedge. Nor am I, she said finally. He nodded, once, as though that were an acceptable answer. As though he had expected it, or something like it. He picked up the secateurs from where she had set them on the garden wall, looked at them briefly, and handed them back to her. The ones on the east side need cutting back, he said. They'll strangle the wall if they're left. I know, she said. I've been doing this since I was 9 years old. I know, he said. I can tell. He left her to the roses. The gate opened and closed. She stood in the garden that had been her mother's and her grandmother's, and someday, she thought, not soon, not simply, not without a great deal of Edinburgh correspondence, might be hers again. She cut back the east side. The last of the October light came through the gap in the yew hedge and lay across the south wall. And the roses, for a moment, were exactly as she remembered them.